The Qin state, which was one of the 7 warring states of 5th and 4th centuries BCE China, developed a powerful centralized government and gathered a large force of farmers and soldiers, and in the second half of the 3rd century BCE, it defeated the other 6 states one by one. In the year 221 BCE, the Qin king Zheng conquered the small territory which was all that was left of the Zhou Kingdom that had ruled all 7 states, and he renamed himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. He went on to expand his domains as far south as Vietnam, though he was less successful at conquering the nomadic horsemen who lived to the north. Thousands of defeated captives were resettled as colonists on his new territories, and the weapons of all enemy soldiers were confiscated and melted down. One of the important innovations of the Qin period was the standardization across the empire of the size and shape of Chinese characters, which was carried out by the Qin chancellor Li Si. He also invented a style of calligraphy that became very widespread. The creation of empire-wide standards in writing, weights, and measures, and the generally centralized character of Qin government reflected the fact that it was heavily influenced by the philosophical school of legalism, which had developed during the Warring States period. It also tended to rule the empire's inhabitants with a heavy hand, and to severely punish them if they disobeyed the authorities. The first emperor divided his realm into districts that were governed by qualified administrators rather than members of the royal family, as had been the case in the Zhou period. And the imperial court exercised direct control over the empire, which was a marked departure from the decentralized Fengjian system of the Zhou period. This emphasis on centralization and on choosing administrators by merit rather than by pedigree was adopted by subsequent dynasties which admired the Qin even though it was autocratic and rejected Confucianism in favor of legalism. The Qin military took even further the innovations in iron weaponry, cavalry tactics, and the use of crossbows that had developed during the Warring States period. But most famously, the first emperor built fortifications to protect the northern border against the barbarians he had been unable to defeat. These became the basis of the Great Wall, which in its current form was built in the 14th and 15th centuries CE. He also created a defense force to protect him after his death, the Terracotta Army buried with him in his tomb near the capital of Qiangyang, which was discovered in 1974. The Qin dynasty's embrace of legalism also meant that other philosophical schools, such as Confucianism and Moism, were actively suppressed. In fact, the narrative called The Records of the Grand Historian, which was written during the Han period, claims that the first Qin emperor ordered the destruction of books that expressed philosophies other than legalism, unless they dealt with practical subjects like medicine, and had the scholars who resisted this directive put to death. But because this policy is not mentioned in any of our contemporary sources, it is now thought to have been a later invention. Though the Qin dynasty was an important influence on the Han and the others that followed it, it was extremely brief. Shi Huangdi died in 210 BCE, and his advisors tried to replace him with one of his sons, whom they were able to manipulate. But this son, and another member of the emperor's family who quickly succeeded him, angered the nobility by raising taxes, spending money lavishly, and executing many local officials. A series of rebellions broke out, and by 207, the Qin dynasty had been replaced by the rebel leaders Shang Yu and Liu Bang, who were from the states of Chu and Han respectively. These two men fought each other while attempting to conquer the other remaining states, and in 202, Liu Bang defeated his rival and declared himself the first Han emperor under the name Gaozu. Before this happened, Qiang Yu decided to reverse the Qin policy of centralization by dividing his territories into 18 Fengjian states, which were mostly autonomous, though there was also territory that was directly controlled by the emperor. He put a group of generals, nobles, and members of his family in charge of the 18 states. While the first two were referred to as the Yiqing Wang, or kings of different family names, the third was known as Tongqing Wang, kings of the same family name. When Liu Bang became emperor, he did the same thing with his own family and allies, but he came to regret this decision, and over the next 50 years, the power of the Yiqing Wang was slowly diminished. The Tongqingwang, on the other hand, were left alone until the middle of the 2nd century BCE, when the Emperor Jing decided to punish several of his powerful relatives by reducing the territory of the states they ruled. These relatives, who had their own armies, responded by staging an uprising called the Rebellion of the Seven States in 154 BCE, after which Jing restricted their power and reduced the size of their domains. During the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the Han Empire was faced with frequent attacks from the north by an alliance of nomadic tribes they called the Xiongnu, who lived in the region of Mongolia. After an invasion in 200 BCE, the two sides signed a treaty as equal partners, but in practice, China was forced to pay the tribes large amounts of goods, and even then, some of them continued to launch raids south of the border. Toward the end of the 2nd century, Chinese forces began to defeat the Xiongnu and managed to force them to retreat. They also incorporated their territory in Central Asia and settled it with colonists. At the same time, the empire was extended southward into southern China and the northern parts of Korea and Vietnam. During the later 3rd century, a diplomat named Shang Qian visited several states in Central Asia and northern India, and Han ambassadors were eventually sent to these places. The trade relationships that developed from these interactions were the beginnings of the Silk Road, which eventually ran through Central Asia to the Parthian Empire and the Mediterranean coast, and opened up trade between China and the Roman Empire. The Hans also began a military alliance with the Kushan Empire in northern India and exchanged gifts with the rulers of Parthia, Burma, and Japan. In the 1st century BCE, there was a change in government policy, whereas the modernist faction that had dominated during Emperor Wu's reign in the late 2nd and early 1st centuries favored the conquest of new territories, which was paid for by government monopolies over commodities like salt and iron. By the mid-1st century, they had lost ground to the reformists, who supported lowering taxes and maintaining the current borders. Emperor Wu also instigated a change in the court's philosophical underpinnings, which until his time had been a combination of Confucianism and legalism. He declared that only Confucian scholarship should be recognized and established an imperial university to train new bureaucrats in its principles. It was at this time that the Records of the Grand Historian was written, as well as a number of Chinese dictionaries. There was a brief break in the Han Dynasty between 9 and 23 CE when a court official named Wang Mang, who had been appointed as the temporary head of government until the new emperor, who was a child, could come of age, declared that he now had the mandate of heaven and was founding his own dynasty, called Qin. He began by reforming government policy. He redistributed land to the peasants and banned slavery, changes that alienated the aristocracy. He was then faced with an uprising of bandits who had been farmers but were forced off their land by massive floods along the Yellow River, which overwhelmed the dams that had been built to contain it. Wang Mang was killed in a riot in 23, and after 2 years, a member of the Han family was able to defeat the bandits and restore the Han dynasty as Emperor Guangwu. He also recovered the territories in Korea and Vietnam that had taken advantage of the change in government to reassert their independence, and attacked the Xiongnu, who had abandoned their arrangements with the Han. Because he moved the capital eastward from Xi'an to Luoyang, the two halves of the Han dynasty are often referred to as Western and Eastern. The effectiveness of the imperial court was hampered in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE by a series of plots and intrigues involving the dowager empresses, the emperor's consorts, and the powerful court eunuchs. The dowager was the mother or the widow of a deceased emperor, and if the emperor's heir should assume the throne when he was still a child, then she or one of her male relatives might serve as his regent until he was old enough to rule independently. A great deal of power could also be acquired by the families of consorts. There was a hierarchy of these women, the most important of whom were queens or empresses, and the rank of a consort determined her son's place in the succession to the throne. Eunuchs, on the other hand, had originally been castrated as a punishment for various crimes, but some of them became important officials of the court, possibly because their infertility meant they could not found their own dynasties, and ambitious men began to undergo this procedure voluntarily. During the Han period, some of these court eunuchs used their influence for corrupt purposes, which put them at odds with government officials who were adherents of Confucianism and believed in rational and fair government. During the 160s CE, a conflict broke out between the two groups, in which the eunuchs were able to have the officials and their student supporters at the imperial university detained, and in some cases executed, in what were called the partisan prohibitions. The restrictions placed upon these Confucian officials lasted until the reign of Emperor Ling, when the court decided to forgive them out of concern that they would join an uprising of peasants that broke out in 184 CE. This uprising, called the Yellow Turban Rebellion, after the headgear worn by the rebels, happened because many peasants had lost their land due to famine in the north. At the same time, they, along with army veterans who could not find jobs, were being heavily taxed to pay for government building projects, while the eunuchs of the court were being accused of widespread corruption. The rebellion, which took decades to suppress, was led not by peasants, but by three brothers who were the leaders of a Taoist sect that ministered to the peasants and saw firsthand how the government was mistreating them. In the same year, a Taoist state that had been founded to the north of the Sichuan province also rebelled against the Han, and for several decades it was politically independent. Beginning in 189 CE, a series of battles were fought between the generals who were opposed to the power a group of eunuchs was wielding over the imperial court and the generals who supported them. This was followed in 200 by a struggle between the general Yuan Shao and the minister Cao Cao over control of the Han Emperor Xian. Though Cao was defeated in 208, his son Cao Pi was able to force Xian to give up the throne to him in the year 220, but rather than a unified government, the state he established became one of three kingdoms into which the former Han Empire was split for the next 60 years. Han society was divided into 20 classes that included everyone between the imperial family and the slaves. Each of these classes had its own privileges, and the highest were given both a government pension and their own lands. Below government officials and scholars were landowners, doctors, craftsmen, and merchants. There were also poor farmers who worked other people's land. The Han government was also a hierarchy made up of several layers. At the top was the emperor himself, who was not limited by law but had a council of advisors whose decisions he was expected to take seriously. He also had 3 counselors and below them 9 ministers. The counselors, whose duties changed over time, were in charge of managing the state budget, appointing high officials, reviewing reports from the provinces, and supervising public works and military matters. The responsibilities of the ministers were more clearly delineated. They included religious ceremonies, the emperor's security, the imperial guards, maintenance of horses and carriages, the administration of justice, receiving foreign dignitaries, relations with the imperial family, finance, and the emperor's personal needs. The empire itself was divided up into administrative units from large provinces to hamlets of 100 families. The provincial governors issued reports about the officials in the regions under their control, while more local officials were in charge of finding people fit for government service, raising troops when necessary, maintaining law and order, keeping tax records, and organizing the labor required of each subject, which amounted to 1 month out of the year. There was also a parallel system of administration for the kingdoms ruled over by members of the royal family. These initially had a great deal of independence from the capital, but in the mid-2nd century BCE, after a number of kings had rebelled and allied themselves with the tribes of the Xiongnu, the Emperor Jing took away their counselors and ministers and appointed their high officials himself. The Han Dynasty had an elaborate system of taxation which funded its building, irrigation, and defensive projects. Taxes on land were collected as a percentage of crops, while individuals also had to pay a personal tax, which was higher for adults than it was for children. Merchants, who were looked at with distaste by the higher orders, were taxed more than others because the government wanted to keep them from becoming too wealthy and powerful, and though they were expected to deal only in money and at one point were barred by law from buying land, some of them were able to become rich property owners. The period of the Three Kingdoms ended in 280 CE, when members of the Sima clan seized power over Cao Wei, the state founded by the Cao family. They then founded the Qin dynasty by conquering the other 2 kingdoms, but after Wu, its first emperor, died in 290, fighting broke out over his succession, and a group of nomadic tribes, including the Xiongnu, invaded. This forced the dynasty to abandon northern China and resettle in the vicinity of Nanjing, which became its new capital. For the next 100 years, there was an uneasy relationship between these rulers from the north and the aristocrats who came with them, and the southerners over whom they had placed themselves, and there were frequent rebellions within the military and elsewhere, while several emperors gained power by murdering their predecessors. At the same time, northern China was broken up into a group of 16 kingdoms ruled by the tribes that had invaded it, and these continued to hold power until a unified northern kingdom was established early in the 5th century CE. But mainland China as a whole did not become a unified empire again until the Tang dynasty of the 7th century, which has since come to be considered a high point of Chinese culture. We will return to discuss this era later in the series.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.